Good morning, everyone. For the second time, you're all very welcome to this very first EU Futures Masterclass. And whether you're watching this live or later on recorded, I know lots of people said that they would like to watch it later on or to use it for all kinds of different purposes. We're delighted to have this opportunity to be with you and to have so much fantastic expertise. So my name is Elaine Fahy. I'm one of the PIs, along with Rebecca Zahn and Fabian Turpan of EU Futures, UASIS James Madison funded network, dedicated to methodologies of studying the EU, in particular how EU law is engaged with EU studies, political economy, political science, international relations. You might think, are they totally mad that they want to do more in methodology? And the answer is absolutely yes, and we're here for more. We're delighted to welcome this morning for this very short and sharp overview masterclass from Professor Arthur Dever, who's a professor at the University of Leuven, who does fantastic work on empirical legal studies, law and economics, and natural legal language processing. And Arthur has finished a really incredible EURC-funded project, EU Authority, that involves a lot of people somehow in this network, and also people today and many other subjects and disciplines, and in particular looking at conflict and cooperation, doing lots of work as to the Court of Justice, how member states engage in multi-level system. I think has really interesting insights and a huge amount of published work, but also lots of experience in talking to other disciplines and trying to bring new insights. So thank you very much, Arthur, for doing this. We're really delighted to have you. And Arthur's just going to speak for a few minutes, and then we're really delighted then thereafter we'll have a very short and sharp intervention from Jan Zaglinski, who's an assistant professor of law at the LSE, and Jan does some really interesting work on constitutional and internal market law and has a new ish monograph out, I think in the last 2 years or so, that Europe's passive values deference to national authorities and EU free movement law, and it's done a fantastic database of 60 years of the free movement of goods case law. So thank you very much, Jan, for agreeing to do this. And we had some exchanges a while ago about how do you talk about empirical reasoning in EU law or empirical matters. And Jan is also organising a very interesting conference shortly that many people are part of. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Arthur, and then we'll go straight into Jan, and I'll try and maybe make some waving signals if everyone gets too loquacious, but otherwise we're recording this. And then thereafter, my colleague Rebecca is going to perhaps maybe intervene a bit, or then we'll see on the sidelines how looking at me dubiously. So thank you very much to you all for doing this, for being here. And without further ado, over to you, Arthur. Delighted to have you.
Thank you, Ellen and Rebecca, for organizing this. It's my great pleasure to address these EU Futures crowd. I've submitted a paper for this talk. The paper is looking at the relationship between trade and interstate relations in the EU. Although, I mean, I'm going to give you some insights, some details about the motivation of the paper. But in my talk, I'm going to focus a bit more on the methodology rather than the findings. So quickly, the motivation for the paper is the following research question: does trade bring nations closer together? And this is a question for which there is already some research, and one of the main hypotheses is called the economic dependency hypothesis. It has been defended by various scholars, including Albert Hirschman. And it's not hard to see why people think that trade can influence foreign policy alignment, so relations between states, whether we think about Russia, about China, for example, China and Australia. But this literature in the economic dependency hypothesis rests on two central assumptions. The first is that states are rational actors, and they weigh the cost and benefits of trade and foreign policy alignment. And the number two assumption is that sovereign states retain the formal power to unilaterally block trade flows. So this is the economic dependency hypothesis. There is another hypothesis which has attracted a lot less research, which is the socialization through trade hypothesis. And you might find some evidence, well, at least some beliefs that this is the way trade might influence nations. You know, for example, in Germany, if you think about the Frieden durch Handel, which was a view very prevalent in German elites. You also find, you know, authors like Montesquieu or John Stuart Mill, who have defended a similar understanding of the effect of commerce on relations among people and among nations. What is interesting here, but this is also a challenge, is that we are dealing with two hypotheses which have the same dependent variable, the same outcome variable, and the same explanatory variable. So the only difference is the mechanism. So if you think about these two, you know, the explanatory and the outcome variable, they are the same. So if you only look at them, you're going to see, you run into a problem of observational equivalence. So the question is how in the real world, how empirically you can possibly disentangle these two mechanisms, these two causal mechanisms, these two explanations. And this is how we came with the idea of looking at the EU, because the EU, the European Union, is a self-contained legal order, unlike, you know, the rest of traditional international law. And this is a term that comes from the writings of Joe Whaler. In the EU, see, if a member state is part of the EU, the terms of trade are defined by the treaties, and they are enforced not by the states, but by a supranational body, the European Commission, and also by domestic courts. And EU law comes with a strict prohibition on self-help countermeasures against other member states. So you cannot use reprisals to punish, you know, other member states when you are part of the EU. So the threat of trade sanctions are off the table. And so this makes the EU a kind of natural experiment where, you know, the assumptions of the economic dependency hypothesis don't quite hold. So that makes it interesting. And we also have the idea of looking at state third-party interventions as a measure of bilateral convergence. So maybe if you're a lawyer, you know that countries regularly intervene as interested third party before a number of international courts, whether it's the WTO dispute settlement body, the International Court of Justice, but also it's also possible before the European Court of Justice. So member states in the EU have the right to intervene in support of state parties or EU institutions when the new institution is party to the case. They can do so in infringement proceedings. They can also do so in annulment proceedings. Here we didn't look at preliminary rulings because in a preliminary ruling, then no state is formally party to the case. So we ignored preliminary ruling, but we look at infringement and annulment cases. What is also interesting is that these cases cover a wide variety of legal issues, some of which are considered, you know, domestic law, domestic issues traditionally. If you look at it from the perspective of international relations. So we collected data on these third-party state interventions before the Court of Justice, and if you look here at the upper panel, you see the number of interventions, friendly, what we call friend intervention, and unfriendly intervention. So when the member state intervenes against another one. And you see, for example, that for some countries tend to intervene generally more, you know, as a friendly third party to another country like Finland. But you see the UK, when it was part of the EU, was not always using these options to express support. It's also interesting to look at the target or the beneficiary of interventions. And if you look at the lower panel, you see that Germany would seem to be the most popular member state. For this kind of data, it's also very interesting to use network analysis. So here we constructed a network with this data. So this is the Friends network, and we conducted some community detection. So we used a community detection algorithm, and you see here the different communities are denoted by the color. So you clearly see like a southern, Western European community with Greece. Spain is the strongest supporter of France. It is also the strongest supporter of Portugal. France also supports Italy. You also have clearly a Nordic community, with Finland being the staunchest supporter of Sweden, and Denmark also being quite friendly to Sweden. There is then a northwestern community with the UK, the Netherlands, Germany, Belgium, Austria, and Ireland. And then there's also a Central European, Eastern European community with the Czech Republic, Poland, and so on. Maybe this reminds you of something. Well, maybe the Eurovision Song Contest. If you look at you do network analysis of the Eurovision, the votes in the Eurovision Song Contest, and you also conduct community detection, you do find similar communities. We also conducted, some regression analysis, and we found that we can predict the communities in the Friends network using the Eurovision data. So if you see here, so the coefficient is positive and relatively large. This is an illustration of how we used a network analysis for this paper. Quickly, so it's not a purely exploratory paper. We wanted to answer this question: does trade influence interstate cooperation? And to address a number of causal identification issues. So for this paper, we used lag trade, so past trade, as the measure of the intensity of trade to predict present trade. So this is to avoid the possibility of reverse causality, that being more friendly to another member state may influence trade in the present. So we're looking at past trade as explanation for present cooperation. And in our statistical analysis, we also include a number of controls, such as DIAD, fixed effects, topic, and enlargement fixed effects. We also use GDP, government ideology. We also control for power in the legislative process. We also control for the effect of the procedure, because there are different patterns in infringement and annulment proceedings. But an important issue we faced was to measure both the substantive focus of legal disputes, but also how cases related to the internal market. Because one possible explanation for the effect of trade on interstate cooperation in CJEU proceedings could be that national governments really care about access to the internal market. So if so, then cases that are closer to the concept of the legal market would be cases that attract more interventions, because this is really what member states care about, so access to the market. So we had to find a way to measure the distance, how a case relates to the internal market. And we've done in the past quite a bit of work using natural language processing and document clustering techniques, such as topic modeling. We have also a paper where we compared, topic prevalence in case law of the Court of Justice, but also in EU legislation and in law reviews, such as the Common Market Law Review. But in this paper, we moved to a more advanced form of document clustering. In fact, it's based on a different paradigm in natural language processing, what is called the distributive linguistic, which is also the paradigm of ChatGPT and so on. which is a way of constructing a richer representation of meaning, but also of documents. So the algorithm we're using here is learning word representation by, in our corpus of EU cases, by guessing a word from its surrounding word and doing this for every word in the corpus. And it's also guessing from the words which document we are dealing with. And then on top of this, it constructs a topic classification. So we end up with a model which has vector representations for both words, documents, and topics. And in fact, the great advantage of this model, it works as a super search engine, which allows you to understand what topics the documents are about, how far a document is from a certain topic, and how far a topic is from a certain concept, and how far a concept is from a certain document. So here you see like the topic representations created by the model on the English corpus, but one challenge with the Court of Justice is that, in fact, there are more decisions in French than in English, so we retrained the model on the French corpus to have more rulings. And so this is the model trained on the French language decisions. And you see here the keywords are like they summarize the topics. But so again, as I told you, we were interested in determining how far a case is from the concept of the internal market. And so in this model, so documents, words, and topics are represented in the same high-dimensional vector space. And the great thing about this is that this model also captures conceptual structures, not just words, but conceptual structures in the sense that, for example, it captures synonymy. There are many ways to talk about the internal market without necessarily using the word internal market. And so even if a case doesn't mention the internal market, because our model has learned from the words surrounding words such as the internal market, we can determine whether this document is close or not to the concept of the internal market. And that's precisely what we wanted to do there. So obviously we did it for the French corpus as well as the English corpus. So marché intérieur is French for internal market. And what you see here are the words most similar to the notion of internal market in this vector space. This is first a way to determine whether the vector you've chosen to look for the concept you're interested in makes sense. And you see here the words that are closest in meaning to internal market in our model are functioning, common, of course, common market, competition, incompatible, compatibility, and so on. But what you see here is, remember like our topic classification, this shows you how far these different topics are from the concept of internal market. So you have topic 3 here, which is the closest to the concept. So that would mean that documents that relate to these topics are closest to the notion of the internal market. Whereas topic 5 is the furthest from the notion of internal market. And if you look, for example, at topic 5, it's about, you see here the keywords, it's about wastewater treatment. So this is an environmental issue, and typically, it has no cross-border dimension. So this was telling us that, our model was working, it was capturing how far a topic is from the notion of the internal market, and thus also it can help us determine how far a case is from the notion of the internal market. And when we did so we conducted various statistical analysis using our topic classification as well as the distance between our conceptual vector, internal market, and the cases. And what we find is that governments are as likely to intervene on issues that don't relate to the internal market as in cases that relate to the internal market, which suggests that they're not primarily influenced by, concerns about access to the market. Because if you intervene in a case like, wastewater treatment, or, you support, France supports Germany, obviously it's probably because it's not, it cannot be driven by, a concern to get access to the German market, because the issue doesn't have any bearing on, doesn't have any cross-border dimension. So the great advantage of using this technique is that it saves you a lot of time, because you have to imagine how you'd have to do this manually. So you would need some assistance to go through all these cases. And we have quite a few here. I think we have more than 2,000 cases. So that would be hopefully time consuming, but also it would take a very long time. So with this, I just wrap it up. I come to my conclusion. So the substantive question is trade a cure for interstate prejudices? Well, we do find some evidence, because you see here in all these models, you see that lag trade, so past trade, has an influence on present cooperation, so the probability of support in a case. So if you trade more, if a member state trades more with another member states, they're also more likely to support each other in cases before the Court of Justice. It would be also interesting, as a sort of follow-up on this paper, to see whether these findings hold using other measures of foreign policy convergence, for example, United Nations General Assembly votes. We have also been exploring different causal identification approach, using, for example, what is called instrumental viable estimation. This is for the econometricians attending the presentation, but I'm really looking forward to the comments of Jan and to the Q&A session. So thank you very much for your attention, and if there are elements for which you need clarification, I'll be happy to provide them. Thank you.
Super. Thank you so much, Arthur. That was fantastic. Without further ado, I'm going to hand over immediately to Jan. Jan, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Elaine. Thanks, Rebecca, for organizing this. Thanks, Arthur, for a wonderful paper. The truth is, the only thing I'm asking myself right now is, why is Germany doing so badly in the Eurovision if it's doing so well in European trade? So that's really the only takeaway for me right now. No, but jokes aside, this is as probably everybody in the Zoom room can see, a phenomenally rich, stimulating paper. But I think more than that, as we're speaking about methods here, it's really a great illustration of the power which empirical research, if well done, can have. Now, why is this so good? I think, first of all, Arthur and his co-authors tackle a big, exciting theoretical question, right? Does trade influence interstate relations? Does it affect a country's willingness to cooperate with or politically support other countries, which has been an important, widely spread assumption in the literature. We're speaking about, as Arthur said, people going back to Montesquieu, Mill, Hirschman, and many, many others. Now, this exciting question is combined with a sophisticated methodology. The paper combines different tools ranging from regression analysis to natural language processing side, which Arthur has explained, all while being very open about the assumptions that are made, explaining methodological choices, the underlying challenges, the limitations of the results. So I think in that sense, it's really a model example of empirical legal scholarship. Now, what I find particularly interesting is that the conclusion also is, in substantive terms, meaningful and important for our understanding of European integration, something which isn't always a given in empirical legal papers. So as I see it, and I think this came through in the presentation, well, the core thesis here is, as Arthur has just explained, trade positively affects interstate cooperation. And I couldn't help but think that Jean Monnet and Robert Schuman are smiling somewhere, because they precisely envisaged this effect when outlining the idea of a European Union. So these are all of the reasons, or some of the reasons, why I think this is a wonderful piece of scholarship, but I'm of course not here just to flatter Arthur and his co-authors. So let me raise a few critical questions about the paper too. Now, the first thing I kind of stumbled on is the construction of the sampling strategy. So Arthur has explained that they chose to focus on annulment actions and infringement proceedings. And I understand that why you're doing that, both for practical reasons, but also for principled reasons, which you've mentioned. It's easier to code preliminary references. It's also easier to identify the direction of support, as you said, because the member state is a formal part of the proceedings. But it did make me wonder if this causes some problems down the road. Now, it's a banal thing, but important no less, that in terms of sheer numbers of proceedings, direct actions constitute a minority of cases only before the court. And over time, they have lost ground more and more vis-a-vis preliminary references. So as you, I'm sure, know, these days, preliminary references account for 2/3 to 3/4 of all cases in a year, which to me raises the question as to whether the sample you're looking at and the two specific types of proceedings are in fact a good reflection of the court's activity and member state behavior more broadly. And other than just the sheer size of these two subgroups, I have my doubt, especially in relation to infringement proceedings, because here member states have historically been very reluctant to make submissions, much more reluctant than in preliminary references, where they intervene more frequently and it seems more freely, and just left the Commission to run things, presumably to avoid the embarrassment of being involved in the naming of shaming of a fellow EU member state and risking that that same member state reciprocates, to use your language, in the future. And that reluctance is reflected in the results of your logistic regression, at least in the first two models. So I think that might potentially affect the overall findings. My second comment relates to the response variable. And here I want to push back slightly against one of the assumptions you're making, which I guess is a central assumption. And I think it might raise some validity issues. Now, in the paper, you say that third-party submissions of one member state provide an unequivocal measure of bilateral support of another member state, right? This is the kind of basic way in which the paper operates. And again, I have some doubts about that. I don't question for a second that bilateral support is an element of what's happening, but I think the whole behavior is much more complex. Because ultimately what we're looking at is the question, why do member state governments submit observations and preliminary references? And I think realistically, at least, reasons will be manifold. In some cases, it may be down, as you say, to wanting to support in other member states, but I think some of it could also be related to being interested in pushing the law in certain directions as well. And I think this is probably the most common, protecting one's own laws. So if, for example, Spain has restrictive legislation on food additives, Germany may want to intervene in the proceedings, not because it feels close to Spain, but because it has similar legislation back home and wants to avoid this legislation being quashed by the court one day. So I think to an important degree, this could be self-serving. So not, in your terminology, about the member state of destination, really, but about the member state that's issuing these observation. And you do in the paper discuss this a little, but I think you only see this as a problem from a perspective of protectionism, economic legislation, internal market legislation, which is that exciting bit of the paper where you do topic modeling. but I suspect it probably applies to any legislation really, because a national government may want to intervene and push for certain interpretation of EU law because it legitimately worries that its own laws might end up being affected by this. And I think the policy field might not matter as much, or at least that's something I would like to see addressed. And then just the final third short comment concerning the discussion of your results, and looking a little bit beyond the strict confines of the paper at the relationship between trade and European integration, which is also a core theme of EU Futures. Now, I was curious, so I've looked at data on intra-EU trade for another paper myself, and it seems that trade between member states is plateauing. So we've had, for a long period, we had a pretty linear growth, and over the past 2 decades, there aren't really significant advances anymore, both in relative terms when we look at share of intra-EU trade in domestic GDP, but also in absolute terms. And that is probably, at the end of the day, to be expected, right? Because states can only trade so much. There is probably some natural ceiling as to how much they can trade. Now, what it did make me wonder is, does that mean there's also a ceiling to how much they can cooperate politically, right? Because, I mean, that's not really something that's being addressed in the theoretical part of these kind of ground authors that you've mentioned, Montesquieu, Hirschman. They're really only interested in the kind of first phase of that growth of sociological liberalism. And looking at the EU, at least, it doesn't seem to me that this captures what is currently happening, because even though, as I've said, over the past 2 decades, we don't see great strides in trade, we do see significant advances in terms of political cooperation, economic cooperation, security cooperation. So could there be, and I guess this is the question to you, could there be a point at which sociological liberalism has done its job, and then a different rationale or modus operandi kicks in, where we still have cooperation, but for different reasons, maybe? And I guess I'll stop here.
Thank you, Jan. That was great. That was fantastic. Thank you both. Such rich contributions. There's so many